animal hoarding situation that could be smelled down the block. Neighbors say the law kept them from helping. Plus, how the Kansas National Guard is ready to do a better job protecting you and your property when the next major wildfire blows through. And some bad numbers for the presumptive Republican frontrunner for Pat Roberts' Senate seat. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. An internal Republican poll shows Kris Kobach trailing Democrat Barry Grissom in a hypothetical general election for the U.S. Senate seat left empty by Pat Roberts' retirement. The Wall Street Journal this week reported a previously unpublished internal Republican poll showing former U.S. Attorney Democrat Barry Grissom leading Kris Kobach in a statewide Senate race by 52 to 42%. According to the Journal, every single other Republican in the race led Grissom by at least 8 points. The Journal says the poll was conducted in June for the National Republican Senatorial Committee and surveyed 600 likely voters in Kansas. The margin of error was plus or minus 4 points. Political analyst Burdett Loomis tweeted out, quote, "Internal polls get released for a reason. In this case, the NRSC is scared to death that KK will be the nominee, thus pulling an apparently safe seat in play." Patrick Miller, a political scientist from the University of Kansas, reminded his Twitter followers Kobach got only 43% of the statewide vote in the governor's election last year, but added the election is also over a year away, and this is just one poll pre-campaign. Lots can change. Kobach's campaign manager told the Journal it's laughable that anyone is taking seriously a poll on a hypothetical matchup conducted 18 months before the election and prior even to Secretary Kobach's entry into the race. Joining me on the desk this week to discuss this and more, we have Adam Strunk, editor of the Newton Now, State Representative Michael Capps, a Republican from Wichita, and State Representative Henry Helgerson, Democrat from Wichita. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, so as we started this, as we look at the Senate race, I don't think there's anything new about these headlines. Everybody's pretty much been saying this, but the fact that it was an actual poll that was done before Kobach even joined the race, I find very telling. Wouldn't you agree, Adam?
I mean, I find telling that it was released. I feel like this is probably pressure to make sure, by the people who are trying to make sure that this isn't a seat in play, to make sure the seat doesn't get put in play. I don't think Kobach's going to be the candidate. I think that's my hot take.
So you're thinking Kobach isn't going to take it? Who do you see taking it right now?
We
got 18 months, but
again, it is 18 months away. I see Mike Pompeo jumping in, but I don't have Mike Pompeo's cell phone number, so I don't really know here. I think that there's going to be someone that steps up. I think the Republican Party is organized enough in Kansas where they are able to wrangle someone that does appeal to the very right people who show up for their primaries that isn't Kris Kobach. I don't think they're going to make the same mistake twice as they did in the governor's race.
Well, and it's certainly very interesting that the numbers in that poll almost paralleled the governor's race.
So, at the end of the day, one of the things that I find telling about the story is the front runner label. I don't know that I would necessarily call any of our candidates the front runner today. That's what a primary is about. We have some really strong candidates in the race. There's the perpetual rumor of Secretary Pompeo's possible emergence into the race, but to be real honest, I don't forecast that myself. We have other really great candidates amongst us. Senator Susan Wagle is a great candidate. Kansas is very likely interested in looking at a female senator to take that position. I think she speaks to the core values of our state. So, amongst all the candidates out there, we'll find out who we want to support and who we get behind. But to label this as a front runner, I think is kind of a mislabel.
Well, that's why we use the term presumptive, because the Wall Street Journal was presuming that he was a front runner. I don't think there have been any polls to show that yet. So this is the only poll I've seen out of this race so far.
I think one of the interesting things is his campaign manager said he's back in New York trying to, raising money. And usually Democrats get accused of going out of state to try to raise money because we don't have enough support or enough money. And here you have the presumptive nominee going out of state to the far right and trying to raise money out of state. I agree. I don't think he's going to be the nominee eventually.
Okay, so what about Roger Marshall? He's in the race officially now. Has some pretty good recognition in western Kansas, but I think eastern Kansas may be an issue for him.
You know, it's going to be dependent on how he's able to bring his message to the citizens as he's out talking. I think there's an awful lot of people have an issue with some of his past positions, whether it's their belief that they're not conservative enough or they're not representative of their positions throughout our state. He's got a lot of work to do to bring that message to Kansas. Obviously, in western Kansas, he's kind of a household name out there, and that will certainly help. But again, we get back to this is what the primaries are about. You know, the candidate's ability to deliver a message. Does it resonate with the voters, with their constituents, and who we're ultimately going to rally behind to represent us in 2020 and beyond?
He made an interesting point when he announced, and that was 60% of the primary vote, I think this is what he used, came from the big first in the Republican primary. That gives him a big edge on every other candidate. But, you know, it's going to be a very uphill race for him.
Yeah. Well, and that big first has been the proving ground for future senators for a while now.
I don't think he's a Jerry Moran, though.
Yeah. So as we look at this race, Adam, is this something that your readers are talking about? Because I know I've done several stories, but when I go out and talk to viewers, they're like,
well, they were talking about the school board bond issue. We got a city commission race coming up. We got a school board race coming up. That's really what they're talking about in Newton, talking about maybe building a new library. They're not real worried about it yet. So.
Remember, when we're talking the 2020 election, we still have 2019 elections. We still have our local election. We're already talking about 2020. It kind of reminds me of the proverbial Christmas shopping season that has continued to get down to the point where before you know it, we're going to be shopping for Christmas in January.
Yeah. Well, and there could be something to be said for a law, hint, hint, that would say people couldn't announce this early, because that's what it comes down to. People announce and we start doing stories.
Yeah, but that being said, you put a law, like people can still announce. You can't,
I'm speaking half facetiously.
Okay.
Only half.
Sorry.
For another day.
Exactly.
But what would we have to talk about?
Oh, I'm sure we could find many other things to talk about. For example, from the air and on the ground, crews from around the state were brushing up on their wildfire fighting skills this week. KSN's Tiffany Lane rode along with the National Guard training.
53 ground, 12 air, and 6 water tender guards with their hands tied this week, preparing themselves for wildfire season.
This came about after the 2016-2017 major wildland fires that we had. That was the Anderson Creek wildfire and also the Starbucks wildfire.
The Kansas Air and Army National Guard want to help assist local agencies the next time a major wildland fire breaks out.
Anytime we have a big fire, our local fire departments have limited resources, so anytime the National Guard and our interagency partners can bring additional resources, it really helps get after the fire and get it under control quickly.
The Guardsmen and women are getting ground training.
This is an M1113 Humvee, and the really nice thing about this particular one is it's outfitted with a Sidewinder cannon, and that allows us to pump water out of the 300-gallon poly tank in the back.
That way crews can fight fires without ever getting out of the vehicle. Crews also tested a new dip tank to help when there aren't water resources available.
And there are certain parts of the state, as you all know, that our proximity to water is a critical issue.
So they practice this. And with help from the Kansas Department of Emergency Services and Kansas Forest Service, Guardsmen and women are getting Wildland Red Card certified.
It's a 40-hour class with some field work and then a physical ability test.
And as I'm told by those putting together this training, this not only benefits local and state agencies, if needed, they can use this training to help during national emergencies as well. In Salina, Tiffany Lane, KSN News 3.
Now, I was out there for that event as well, working on another project, but one thing that they were telling us is that all of this training is designed to kind of fill in gaps for what local fire departments need, and they are expecting possibly this next year, with all the rain we had this year and all the brush that's out there, to have another big season. I mean, and certainly I know there's a legislative committee involved with some of the funding on this. Some big changes that have gone on since those 2016-2017 fires.
Yeah, and people like to hate on studies, but there was a really comprehensive study that followed these fires, and I think it came out in 2018, and it really looked at how Kansas was trying to handle these fires, because what we had was a hodgepodge of different organizations, different memorandums of understanding, different mutual aid agreements, and so we had that fire going on in the south while we had a really large fire in Harvey County at the same time, but all of the state's resources were tapped. So it was literally like cell phone trees, like, hey, Mr. and Olathe, can you drive down and help us out because our roads are melting because it's really hot outside. Like, so it's really nice to see them trying to fill in those gaps. I mean, another thing that study came out and talked about was our forestry service. I mean, we have a very small forestry service, and we spent a very small amount per acre for fire protection compared to like nationally, and this was maybe we figure out how to fill in those gaps, and it's nice to see that the National Guard would provide, or the Kansas National Guard would provide some of those resources.
You know, something that kind of goes overlooked a lot of times is whether you're talking about the Air National Guard or the National Guard.
In this case, it was both.
In this case being both, but whether we're talking 21st century cybersecurity efforts all the way to fire protection, emergency response, one thing that Kansas sometimes doesn't get the recognition for is our National Guard services are extremely well trained in relation to a lot of the other states around the country and what they invest into them. In fact, it's evident so much in that other states, especially our surrounding states, often request assistance from our Guard services. Now, mind you, I mean, that's not always something that we can provide, but the fact that other states, our neighboring states, are saying, Kansas, could we get a little assistance from you all? It's very telling to the level of training professionalism that these folks are putting in our state, and I don't think we ever really highlight that beyond our state as much on a national footprint. I mean, we certainly appreciate the service they give us here, but the national footprint says that they're doing very well compared to their peers.
No.
I echo those words. But the other thing to keep in mind, we sometimes don't look at regional problems that we have, be it in dealing with the fires and bringing everybody together to try to come up with a good solution, whether or not it's fires, healthcare. You know, that's one of the things we need to stress as legislators and as communities. It's not just Western Kansas and Eastern Kansas that vie for the resources. We're all in it together. How do we work together to make sure that we cover all the bases?
Something I would kind of add to that in the same breath, and this is really actually for listeners out there tonight, especially our local community leaders, our National Guard is waiting for the ask. They're on standby. When they're, I mean, if you got a community that's got a water outage, you've got a community that's lost a main transformer and they have no power within 100 miles, whether it's a fire of that nature, I mean, whatever the crisis that our communities face, they're waiting for the ask. And that is a requirement that we have in the way the law is set up, that our communities have to ask for the National Guard assistance. They can't necessarily volunteer it.
Yeah. Well, and certainly with all the equipment they have now, they are set up to be able to handle, as you pointed out, more than one major fire at a time if they need to. So that definitely went into their thought process as they were doing this training.
Yeah, so we'll see how it turns out.
Yeah, and hopefully it's not too bad next year, but they did sound pretty worried about it, the National Forest Service folks that were out there.
It is Kansas.
Yeah, well, it is Kansas, and that means there's lots of grass, lots of farmers on that grass.
And not to take up too much time, but red cedars are a huge problem in the state, and they continue to get bigger and bigger and grow and spread. So cut out your red cedars in your pastures.
And that's your PSA for the day. Moving on, nearly 30% of American farmers do not yet have access to the internet, yet many modern farming techniques require it. The FCC chairman told Cake News' Jake Bowles this week he's got a plan for that.
The bandwidth needs for rural communities are higher than many people think.
The chairman of the FCC spoke at the East Wichita Marriott Thursday to a group trying to get internet access to more people.
This conference is about broadband in Kansas, and so we're interested and want to tell our story as how we depend on broadband. And we have a lot of remote workers.
Darren Miller is a business owner whose workers don't always have access to high-speed networks, and he's not alone. Rural parts of Kansas face challenges for laying new lines.
There has to be a business case, so you have to have that return on the investment. And so that in some cases requires federal subsidies.
The chairman said high-speed internet is important to agriculture.
Some people, for example, when they think of the internet, they might think, well, all the person needs to do is to download Netflix movies and the like. But for example, if you're on a connected farm, you are creating a lot of data from some of the sensors that are monitoring, say, a cornfield or a soybean field, and you need to upload that very quickly. So we're talking about a huge amount of bandwidth, both downloaded and uploaded, and so that means you need to have high-capacity broadband networks.
Chairman Pai said he thinks events like the one today help push broadband forward, and that means a lot to underserved communities like Chase County.
It gives me the chills because I'm so passionate about broadband service being available to everyone, and leaving this conference just inspires me to go back to my community and say, I know these are still challenges we face, but with the resources that I've learned here, the networking that I've done here, there is a way forward.
And I know in the House this last year, we now have the Rural Revitalization Committee that Don Heineman is leading, and broadband has been one of his leading issues. Have we heard anything yet about what might be coming out of that committee at all?
Out of the committee? I'll look to my left. You know anything coming out of the committee?
Well, I'm going to go back to the same point that we heard about transportation. Everybody wants the Cadillac, but nobody wants to pay for it. In western Kansas, can you have the same services as Johnson County? Probably not, because you don't have the economic base to do that. How do we subsidize it? Federal funds haven't been that much available. Maybe they will be in the future, but I doubt it. We struggle with the transportation system. We struggle with an internet. I'll go back to the same point I made 5 minutes ago. It's regional plans in order to build up an economic base. And that's what's the solution. And hopefully Representative Heineman and his committee will come up with some solutions, not just requests for more money.
Something I'd put out there, not to get too far off into a tangent, but when you look at some of the regions in the Middle East that have been decimated over the years through war fighting, when they've come back through to build those, they've built them up with nothing more than the wireless technology. They've foregone copper, traditional broadband models. I think one of the things we need to do is look one step past the broadband need and be looking at the cellular capabilities. For example, in this case, western Kansas, you know, we often put so many barriers up to cellular providers getting a tower in the air. Those towers, honestly, my cellular service right now actually is faster than a lot of people's home internet today. And so I want to focus on the fact that we need to have that access, especially to our farming community and our rural areas, but that wireless level, especially through cellular, honestly is probably a more effective thing that we should be looking at to get it there faster, cheaper, and hopefully with a better return on investment.
Yeah.
I mean, are you guys' committees, and I'm talking about, I think all kinds of ideas are great, are your guys' committees talking all about something like, I mean, what, 100 years ago, we didn't have electrification in rural areas. We had rural electric co-ops, like that's how my family's farm got electricity. Is there any kind of a opening for that kind of a model to where it is almost a cooperative share of resources to somehow fund these?
Well, some of the co-ops are already utilizing their existing resources to be able to push for greater broadband. And I just saw a large-scale deployment in Butler County just in the last 90 days maybe. So the co-ops can definitely fill a gap as well, but you still have that, what we call the last mile, if you will, those parts of the rural communities where they're not even within that type of a range. And you've got a very expensive build out to dig trenches or run poles to run lines that you have to recover an investment for. Or you can put a tower up that's just going to blanket a 50-mile radius area and provide that connectivity. That's why I'm an advocate more that we should be looking at those emerging technologies, not really emerging, but those technologies in lieu of traditional running cable.
You asked. I don't think anybody has come across and said, this is what the plan or the goal is. Nobody has come up with that kind of a detailed analysis and says, this is where we need to be in the next 20 years, 30 years. Maybe Don's committee will do that. I don't know. That's the kind of big thinking that we need in this state right now.
Yeah. Well, and certainly bringing it back to the transportation that you were talking about, the transportation, the interim task force, every decade or so comes up with its plan, its vision for the next 10, 20 years down the road. So maybe we need to do that as a state for technology.
It's something that's been talked about, but last year I introduced a bill trying to raise some gas tax money to take care of the transportation. And I didn't get anybody else supporting it. Are we going to get money dedicated from some kind of dedicated tax to take care of broadband and take care of technology for the next 20 years?
Well, Farm Bureau likes this idea, though.
Yeah, but
so you get a few.
I get some, yeah, but nothing in the legislature. That's how difficult it is. It's coming out with a plan and saying, not only do I think it's a good plan, I'm willing to vote for it, and I'm voting to put the money there that may take a tax increase or at least takes money away from something else.
And I'll give credit to the representative. The thing that I see the most, in Topeka is a lot of talk, not a lot of action. So, it's great to talk that we got rural broadband issues. It's great to talk about the transportation issues. At the end of the day, it's going to take those brave legislators, those few brave legislators to actually step forward, introduce the bill, say, I'm going to back it up, and tell me why it's a bad idea.
I'll keep track for your introductions.
Well, action certainly was something that there were some questions why there wasn't enough of it earlier in Butler County this last week. The sheriff there calls it the worst case of animal hoarding he's ever seen. KAKE's Greg Miller takes a look at the conditions deputies faced.
As crews searched a neglected home near Augusta and tried to rescue at least 60 hoarded cats inside, Stephanie Hines watched from next door.
And was told animals are property, and as long as she shows up periodically to feed them and they have access to water, that there's nothing that you can do, that is the law.
For more than 3 years, she's called the sheriff's office, emailed animal rescue groups, trying to get someone to help the animals inside that home.
The air conditioner was so totally grown over, we knew there was no air conditioner running. We knew in the winter there was no heat running because the windows would ice over from the inside.
But none of those groups could ever go in until the renter gave them permission, because in Kansas, they're considered property.
Our hands continued to be tied because once in a great while she'd give them food, and we knew that the basement had water issues, so I figured that's where they were getting their water.
The sheriff's office says the renter didn't even live there, that she would simply drop a bag of food off inside and then leave again. But she finally gave them that permission to go in this week.
We have made entry now. We're working a criminal case for animal cruelty.
When you first pull up, you'll notice a beware of dog sign on the door, some caution tape below, but what you really notice, especially if you're downwind, is the stench of decaying animals. And the sheriff says the conditions inside were horrifying.
The stench is so bad that we got respirators on, and we got Tyvek suits on, we got booties on our feet. We sprayed our people with tick and flea spray.
Charges are pending, but Hines says the laws need to change if any of this was allowed to go on for so long.
I'm sad and I'm angry all at once. And just to know that there aren't laws that make this any quicker.
And that's kind of one of the things that I wonder about. We were talking about this case a little bit before the show and how we'd seen some similar cases in the counties around Sedgwick over the last year or so, and similar issues where they couldn't go in at first. Is there some point where probable cause, shouldn't that come into play, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I mean, you would hope that, but again, what is probable cause? Like, so someone's property smells really bad. What do you define as probable cause? Because I agree. We got to figure out a way to make sure stuff like this doesn't happen. But I also wonder, setting some of these things in place on what makes probable cause. It's not as simple to just write a law that says a smelly backyard makes probable cause, because 99% of people will follow that, and then 1% will abuse that and say, okay, now I've got probable cause for all kinds of stuff. No. So I mean. And I didn't catch, was this in limits or out of limits?
It was out of the city limits.
So I mean,
but
when you have stuff in city limits,
yeah.
I mean, you can have, there's some public health inspections, and that comes down to basically how aggressive the city is in enforcing some of its public health code. But out of city limits, I don't know, do you report it to the county and say it's a health issue? I don't know, do you guys have thoughts on this?
So, at least for me, most of the time, every case is different, but let's also realize that animal hoarding also a lot of times is tied to some sort of mental illness. Not always. I mean, sometimes it's outright animal cruelty, and we need to deal with it accordingly. But when you have an underlying mental illness, I think we at least need to look at that. When we talk about how we can fix it, we need to realize that the probable cause is a really good discussion point. But for me, why not extend what we already have in the laws? The U.S. Supreme Court has already ruled under, the unreasonable search provisions of the Constitution that a welfare check for the well-being of an adult, a child, somebody in the home, is grounds to enter a premise without necessarily having probable cause. Now, again,
how do you define what is an animal welfare check? Like, I mean, I bet if you'd see like a dog chained up in the winter, like I could see that being an animal welfare check. But this is a closed house. So, like, I guess they could say it stinks, like something's dead in there.
I meant, you know, if you have a neighbor that calls the police and says, you know, the neighbors have children that are being abused, and then guess what? They can go in and check on them. A neighbor wants to call and say, look, I'm hearing about 300 now. Maybe you ought to go check on it. And again, it would have to be very scope limited. But the problem I have with that is that everything that you give the government to do eventually gets abused at some level. But I agree, we've got some problem that we have to try to solve somehow.
Yeah. And this is something that has been an ongoing issue. It kind of goes to some of the issues within the legislature of getting something passed. You've got to think. It's like, yeah, it seems simple. Pass a law that fixes this. But then there are all the but what ifs that come into play as you guys are working on those laws.
I think we'd give up a lot also. People like their independence. People don't want to give up. Where's the difference of having 2 or 3 or 10 dogs or 10 cats, and are you taking care of them? And the next door neighbor says no. It has been a problem, but maybe it's a problem because the neighbors and the friends didn't intervene like they should have also. I can take you in houses in Wichita that have had this historic problem, and you know, people just looked the other way because they didn't want to deal, or they didn't want to help the person that had a mental health issue.
They want the problem to go away, they just don't want to have to deal with it.
That's exactly right.
Fixing it. Yeah. Well, so many issues involved there. I don't think we're going to solve them today, but thank you so much, Adam and Michael and Henry, for joining me. I've appreciated our discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. I want to also thank our news partners at KSN News, Cake News, and the Wichita Eagle for sharing their materials with us. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion. We'd love to continue it online. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV or KPTS Channel 8 on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For now, have a great week.